Ben Myers, KC, King's Counsel, was Lucy Letby's barrister during the trial, which led to her conviction for murders and attempted murders that she did not commit. And he has gotten a lot of flack for his performance in that trial. And I agree with a lot of the flack. He did not seem to be up to the task at hand. However, I don't know that anybody would have been. I think Ben Myers did the best he could in an almost impossible situation. Did he make mistakes? Absolutely. But he also faced many aspects of this case that just piled up against him. The first being the amount of medical evidence and medical detail involved in this case, which went above everyone's heads, including the expert witnesses, because this medical evidence was not actual evidence at all. It was the fabulation of one man who, for some reason, was able to get a large swath of the population to listen to him. So that was one aspect that Ben Myers was working against. The amount of time that passed, both in the investigation, the very flawed investigation against Lucy Letby by the police, all the way through the trial, which was the longest in British history, that timing worked against him for a number of reasons. The media skewing the judgment of the public ahead of the case worked against him. And then finally, and most importantly, the very partial judge who ruled over the case went against Ben Myers. And so trying to investigate Ben Myers's work in the Lucy Letby case, I think requires including Justice Goss as well. So while this video is about Lucy Letby's defense barrister, it's also about Justice Goss, because he's a big reason why Ben Myers failed in his bid to elucidate Lucy Letby's innocence in this case. And to start, Ben Myers didn't have as much time as the prosecution had. And this is built into legal criminal proceedings across the world. But the way that it is countered is in requiring the prosecution to disclose anything pertinent that might undermine their case. And there is at least one instance where Nick Johnson, who was the main prosecutor in the case against Lucy, did not do this. He didn't present maternity and obstetric notes to the defense. And he and the CPS say it's because the notes weren't relevant since the prosecution didn't use them to build a case against Lucy Letby. And Dewi Evans, the main medical expert witness for the prosecution, claims not to have seen them at all, aside from some brief notes about each baby, which I question. I question everything Dewi Evans says, but I question whether he didn't have access to the maternity notes or whether he rejected the maternity notes so that he didn't have to see the ways in which these infants passed. That would go against this case that he was building. The defense not having access to these maternity notes lowered their ability to present alternative causes of death in the trial. And this was a great wrong that Nick Johnson committed against the court, because it was his duty to present these maternity notes, and he did not. There were other ways that Ben Myers failed in his duty to Lucy Letby. And this is a personal take, but I think he was too subtle in his questioning. I think he expected the jury to be able to pick up on the points he was making without pointing them out specifically. And he also left things out when he questioned, particularly Dewi Evans. And I'm going to focus on his questioning of Dewi Evans because Dewi Evans was the case. So I think it's most effective to focus on his questioning of Evans. So when he was questioning Evans on baby I, he was asking him about an incident that Evans mentioned on August 23rd, 2015, where air, Evans alleged, had been administered to the baby's tubes that then splinted the diaphragm, which led to respiratory failure for the baby. But Lucy Letby was not on duty on August 23rd, 2015. And Myers didn't mention this in the cross-examination. He allowed Dowie Evans to continue with his fantasy and never interjected, saying, would you agree that Lucy Letby was not on duty that day, or whatever it is that he would say to acknowledge this for the jury? Now, I know that this was acknowledged in other aspects of the trial, that Lucy Letby was not present, but I would think that that would be a very important detail that he would want to add into his cross-examination so that the point was driven home very securely that many times Lucy Letby was not present for the crimes she was alleged to have committed. So he just continues questioning the air embolism theory and trying to disprove it. But again, you'd think that he'd mention her not being there at all. When Myers was questioning Evans about Justice Jackson's letter, where he presented the possibility that Evans was not balanced and not a fit expert witness, he was asking Evans to discuss part of Justice Jackson's letter, which we'll address later, where Jackson suggests that Evans twists facts to be able to win for whatever side he is testifying for. And he allows Evans to go on and on and on and on, probably hoping that Evans is talking himself into circles and that it's obvious to the jury what kind of a person he is, but I think that's expecting too much of the jury. I'm not sure I understand why Myers would not interject to point out the many inconsistencies that Dowie Evans presents as he's defending himself against Justice Jackson. And I think he should have been more explicit in what he was trying to say by questioning Evans about his place in family court. And I'm just going to read a bit of it so you can see what I mean about what Evans is saying and where I think Myers should have interjected. So he's going on and on and on about why he didn't think this report was going to be used and why it wasn't a report and was actually a letter, and just talking in circles. And then at one point he said, "What concerns me particularly is that I have prepared dozens and dozens and dozens of reports for the family court. To my knowledge, my lord, there's only one report where the judgment went against me in 30 years of doing this work, and that judgment was reversed on appeal. Okay? This is the only judgment that's gone against me in family court." Why didn't Myers interject there and point out that Evans's job is not to win cases? Evans's job is not to twist facts so that his side wins, as he's suggesting here. Why didn't he point that out to the jury? Why did he let him keep going? He did things like that a lot, which I think is problematic. I'm sure there's a reason that I don't understand, but it's just something I noticed. Here's another aspect of this. He continues and says, "Obviously, it saddens me because I wouldn't say it's a 100% record, but I'm in huge demand for my opinion in the family court because of my track record over 30 years or more as a witness in my own practice and as an independent witness." So all of this self-congratulatory language should have been called out by Myers, but wasn't. And this happened many times from what I've seen, and I have not read the entire trial notes. But it seems to be customary for the questioning with Evans, and it's problematic, I think, because the jury needs to really be forced to think about Evans's contradictions and the person that Evans obviously is, and whether this person should be responsible for another person's life when testifying in such an important case. He did his best in questioning what I will generously call an unbalanced person. Myers was entirely rational and correct in his questioning. He was genteel in a genteel world in his questioning, but he was appealing to the rational side of the jury in an entirely irrational setting. The jury had already made up its mind. They said it 3 days into the case. Evans was just the icing on the cake. To have someone who was willing to say and do anything to win was just icing on the cake for the prosecution. And Myers was not up to the task to face that kind of delusion. Myers does his best to point out to Evans the many ways that he is a hypocrite in his language and in his behavior. But he's so subtle in doing it that I don't know that the jury really spotted it. Here are some examples of where he tried to point out Evans's hypocrisy, and I think, judging from Lucy's conviction, he failed. He was questioning Dowie Evans about baby G, and Evans had said that baby G's margins of survival were very good before the baby's collapse. And when Myers used this language, Evans interjected and said, I didn't say that. I said margins of viability. And Myers said, oh, really? And he showed him the report where Evans used the word margins of survival. And Evans had to concede that he used that word, but he insisted that they mean the same thing. Whereas later he will use language and twist language and say that things mean a very specific thing and you can't just be willy-nilly with semantics. So which is it? And he pointed this out, but I don't think he was quite aggressive enough with it. He also challenged Evans on baby D, who had pneumonia and was unwell from 12 minutes of birth and had not received antibiotics, nor had the mother until it was too late, hours after birth. And Evans had claimed that she was near complete recovery when she passed away, sadly. And Myers questioned him about this and said, how could she have been near complete recovery when she was ill from 12 minutes of age, didn't receive antibiotics, had pneumonia, and was clearly an unwell baby? And Evans refused to concede that his language was absurd in this case. And it's just another example of Myers trying to point out Evans's inconsistencies, but not doing it with enough rigor for the jury to be able to really lock in on those inconsistencies. Another example of this, where Myers did a good job of eviscerating Evans's medical diagnoses, but not a good enough job in bringing the jury in on it, really forcing the jury to look at Evans's lies and obfuscations. So he was questioning Evans about baby G, and Evans had claimed that baby G was overfed, causing a distended stomach that splinted the diaphragm and led to respiratory failure, and that was the cause of death. And he mentioned in his reports that before feeding, a nurse must aspirate the infant to find pH levels, which means that the stomach is emptied of contents, and those contents are tested for pH levels. And if there was a pH level of 4, then that proved that the stomach contents had been checked and that there should be no milk in the baby's stomach. Yet, Evans said, hours later, there was a large volume of milk and vomit. Therefore, the baby must have received more milk than she should have. So his assumption of overfeeding, that Lucy Letby had intentionally overfed this baby so that the stomach was distended, the diaphragm was splinted, and respiratory failure ensued, was based on the fact that the nurse had aspirated the baby. But Myers challenged Evans on this and suggested that he changed his evidence because he heard the nurse's testimony where she said she did not aspirate the baby and empty the stomach after checking pH balance. And so Evans, Myers suggested, wanted to make sure his story of overfeeding lined up and changed his testimony midway through after hearing someone else's testimony by saying that a syringe plunger had been used to force additional milk into the stomach of the infant under pressure. But this was not in any of Evans' initial 6 reports. Nothing about a syringe plunger was mentioned in any of his reports until after he heard the nurse's testimony. So Myers was calling him out on this. And I think he did a good job of calling it out in a rational circumstance. But I don't think he was specific enough with regard to Evans's lies and obfuscations. He did his best, but I think his language could have been simpler and different and more specific and more aggressive, frankly, regardless of what Justice Goss's response would have been. Evans also changed his mind, as is very commonly known, about baby C's cause of death on the stand. After talking about other cases of splinting of the diaphragm, he decided that this must be what took baby C's life as well. And Myers suggested that if he really thought that was the cause of death, he would have said so before that day in court. And again, pointing out the obvious, but I don't know that he was pointing it out in an aggressive enough fashion. He was in an impossible situation. He was cross-examining a man who devised grisly, horrible fabulations through a long investigation and court case in which an innocent woman was being burned at the stake. Myers was no match for Evans, not because he wasn't smarter. He was and is. Not because he wasn't more rational and correct. He was and is. But because his mind could never match the demented mind that sat in the witness box. Nothing Myers could say would make Evans falter because Evans was so far gone, he couldn't see the nose on his own face. And the jury was gone then, too. They were fooled by a charlatan and a scoundrel. Myers knew what he was dealing with. He reminded the jury that Evans was not fit for his role, but it didn't matter. The jury had been long lost before that due to a series of injustices that Myers could never undo. Why didn't he call defense witnesses to counter the madness is a question that has been asked many times, and there is no answer from the people who really know, but there has been a lot of speculation. He did call one expert witness, a non-medical expert witness, who was a plumber who had regularly visited the Countess of Chester's neonatal unit because of the plumbing issues there. He testified that sewage was coming up through the toilets and the sinks and coming through the ceiling, and that he was regularly there to try and fix the problem. And this is a very important thing that needed to be noted for the jury. He definitely should have been called because the sewage issues and the pipes that were failing in the hospital were leading to Pseudomonas, which is a leading cause of sepsis. Unfortunately, the doctors at the Countess of Chester were not good at recognizing sepsis. And so they didn't pick up on these issues. However, it was important to point it out. But he needed more than just a plumber. He needed medical expert witnesses. And the question is, why didn't he call them? He did have one medical expert witness, Mike Hall, who was never called to the stand. And no one knows exactly why, but again, there have been suggestions. And Hall himself, who was present through the entire trial, said she did not get a fair trial, just to note. Phil Hammond suggested that it would look better to put no experts up against 13 prosecutorial witnesses, both the medical expert witnesses, 6 of them, and then 7 consultants from the Countess of Chester who accused Lucy, then it would look to put 13 witnesses against 1. And I see his point there. If you can only get 1 witness, then what does that look like to the jury? Whereas if you don't call witnesses at all, the jury can infer that you've decided not to call witnesses, that you could have called witnesses, but that you decided not to. So I get his point. It's always difficult to get medical expert witnesses for a number of reasons, one of which I imagine is the time it takes to be a part of a court case, particularly one like Lucy Letby's, which was 10 months long in total. Most doctors who are working don't have the time to devote to a court case. Therefore, retired doctors like Dewi Evans have the time to commit to court cases. And so those are the types of people that you get in court cases. And there's also professional risk in being a medical expert witness, both on the prosecution side and on the defense side. An example of the prosecution side is Roy Meadow, who was eviscerated for his testimony against Angela Canning, which was later proven to be flawed and which led to her exoneration. Roy Meadow deserved that evisceration, but other doctors who saw that happen don't want to be held responsible for testimony that might later prove to be wrong and have their careers destroyed because they testified to their best ability and then wound up being wrong and become the center of an embarrassment and an enormous mistake that leads to an incredible injustice. So that's one reason. For the defense, many doctors fear testifying against the establishment. There were the shaken baby cases where Dr. Wayne Squire testified in favor of the parents and tried to show that shaken baby syndrome is not a real thing, but because there was a gang of doctors that really pushed for the shaken baby syndrome diagnosis, she was pushed out of the medical field and not allowed to practice after a long experience with the General Medical Council. So that kind of thing makes doctors afraid to testify for the defense, particularly in cases of child abuse or child death, because it's emotional. They don't want to have their careers destroyed because they're supporting what many believe to be a criminal. So it's hard to get witnesses for the defense. It's hard to get medical expert witnesses at all. So not only did Myers have the issue of what his medical expert witnesses would say in court and whether what they said would damage Lucy Letby's case, but he also had the challenge of not being able to get witnesses at all, particularly in a case like Lucy Letby's, where most of society believed her to be guilty. She was already guilty before she ever had a court case, according to the media and therefore society. So to get a doctor to defend her was very difficult. Not anymore, but it was at the time. So with all of that going against him, Myers also had the partiality of Justice Goss to contend with, who would not let defense experts testify before Lucy Letby, which was Myers' application. Myers argued to the court that it would help support the defense of Lucy Letby if defense witnesses could testify right after the prosecution's witnesses, right after Dewi Evans et al. Testified, so that the details of the prosecution's case were fresh and the counter arguments would make fresh sense. As it stood in court, the order was typically prosecution witnesses, defendant testimony, and then defense medical expert testimony with cross-examinations in there. But Myers wanted the complicated medical aspects to be held in one place with back and forth discussion about the viability of the accusations. So he asked Goss to change that order for the case. He asked Goss to make it so that the prosecution experts testified, then the defense experts testified, and then the defendant testified. Goss refused this application, which meant that Lucy, who was interviewed for 24 hours by the Chester police, and had accepted certain medical assumptions without challenging them, such as insulin, air embolus, etc., because how could she challenge them? She wasn't an expert. She had to accept what she was being told. But because of that, questioning her before her experts would mean questioning her under the framework of an acceptance of what Evans et al. Had said. So for this reason, calling Mike Hall became risky because once Lucy Letby testified, he would be expected to give an independent opinion. And if that contradicted anything that Lucy Letby said at all, the prosecution would highlight those inconsistencies, which is completely counter to justice. How could Lucy claim anything? She was a nurse. She was not a doctor. She could only agree. There's no way that she could challenge expert witness testimony. But the prosecution didn't care about that at all, generally speaking, and would manipulate any inconsistencies to influence the jury's emotions over rationality. So this meant that Hall would have been responding after Lucy Letby had committed herself to her testimony, and her testimony could only be based on what she knew to be true as a nurse. She couldn't challenge Evans, and yet not challenging Evans would mean inconsistencies in Hall's testimony. So therefore, the defense decided that cross-examination was the best way to counter Evans at all. And just to note, Evans claimed to have known that the defense would not call experts and would rely on cross-examination because their report, which he read in disclosure, were prepared to counter his reports rather than explain what could have actually happened to the infants. My question is, who is he comforting? in saying that they wouldn't call experts? Who was he comforting when he said that? And why was comfort required? Goss made many calls like this, which hobbled the defense. And truly, one must wonder why. That's all I'll say about that. Here are some examples. He allowed Evans to remain as a main expert witness, even after another high-ranking judge, Lord Justice Jackson, who I mentioned before, wrote a letter imploring him to throw out Evans' testimony. Jackson gave examples of Evans arranging facts to suit his case in the past to win an appeal. There was a case of child abuse in which Dowie Evans became involved in the appeal of the parents. So he was on the defense side at this point. And without having any history with the case, he came in and suggested that vitamin D deficiency is what caused the fractures in this child. And his appeal didn't win in the end, but Justice Jackson, who was the judge in the case, noticed along the way how Dowie Evans would twist the facts to suit the side that he was supposed to be supporting and not considering his role to the court at all and his duty to the court at all. So in this letter, he pointed this out. This is just one example of the ways that Dowie Evans would twist facts in order to win. Justice Jackson also talked about how Evans was biased and that his opinions were completely unbalanced and worthless. But Goss didn't listen. Goss didn't care. Goss left it to the jury to decide whether Evans should remain as the medical expert witness. And the jury, already being won over by emotion, allowed him to remain. Myers repeatedly challenged Evans's methodology and conclusions, but Goss generally ruled that the disagreements affected weight rather than admissibility. Admissibility being whether the jury should be allowed to hear the evidence, and weight being how much they should believe or rely upon it. Goss allowed the jury to decide and kept this evidence in and kept Evans's evidence in because he felt it was more about how much they should trust the evidence rather than whether they should hear it at all. Goss allowed circumstantial evidence to play a role in the court, much against Myers's applications against it. Myers argued that the notes, the supposed confession notes, the Facebook searches, the texts she sent, the flawed statistical charts, the handover sheets, all were circumstantial, and that the evidence was weak and prejudicial. In other words, one could make whatever one wanted of these things and that it didn't prove guilt at all. But Goss didn't seem to agree, and he allowed this circumstantial evidence to remain in court, even though Myers was completely correct in his assertion. Goss instructed jurors that they could infer guilt from the overall body of evidence, even when no single piece proved an allegation by itself. He ruled against Myers's application to withdraw air embolism allegations when Myers argued that there was insufficient scientific evidence. Goss left it to the jury again. Myers argued that there was no case to answer on some of the counts against Lucy halfway through the trial. And in doing so, he relied on Mike Hall's reports that there were plausible natural explanations for some of the baby's deteriorations. But the prosecution objected that because Hall had not testified, this couldn't be allowed because his reports couldn't be allowed because he hadn't testified. Goss agreed. Because Goss rejected Myers's applications to remove certain counts before the verdict, Myers argued in the Court of Appeal that Goss had made illegal decisions, but unfortunately, the Court of Appeal did not agree. They said that Goss exercised his discretion properly, which is questionable, which is probably more based on a desire to remain steady with the system rather than actually looking at the case, but I'll say no more on that. Goss allowed the exclusion of the RCPCH reports on the Countess of Chester neonatal unit, completed after the consultants at the hospital insisted a review be done to prove that Lucy Letby was a murderer. The RCPCH results were that the neonatal unit was below standard and that no individual had caused the deaths and collapses Goss thought it was acceptable to leave that report out and not allow the jury to see that there was a very important medical group that had concluded that the hospital was in bad shape and that that was the cause of deaths, not an individual. He thought it was fine that the jury didn't see that. Goss also allowed the exclusion of Lucy's grievances against the consultants at the hospital. Lucy, after the RCPCH report, had sent a letter to the hospital management listing all of the ways that she had been mistreated by the consultants and asking how those issues were going to be resolved. And after examining all of these aspects of her grievance, they upheld all of her grievances and forced the consultants to apologize to her. My first question is, why would a serial killer want to bring more attention to her case? But my second point is the jury should have seen this. They should have been aware that the very people who were accusing Lucy of murder had been forced to apologize to her for bullying her, for calling them out on their poor practice. The jury didn't see it because Goss didn't think it was necessary. Justice Goss retired from the bench shortly after the Lucy Letby case, much like Dewi Evans retired from being a medical expert witness. But again, I'll say no more about that. Ben Myers was hobbled from the beginning. He was in a kangaroo court, just like Lucy Letby, and I can only imagine what a nightmare it was and how surreal it must have been to try to defend her in these circumstances. It seems like one of those nightmares where you're being chased by an attacker and you can only move at a snail's pace because you're walking through quicksand or mud. There are some opinions I will mention that Ben Myers was part of a grand conspiracy to put Lucy Letby in prison in order to cover up for many failings on many counts in many systems. And frankly, I wouldn't say no to any theory. I don't know. But I think that's giving the system too much credit. I think the truth is that Ben Myers was not up to the task at hand. I don't think anybody would have been up to the task at hand at that point in those circumstances. I do think that Mark McDonald's team is up to the task. There has been a great shift in understanding about this case, and he is in a great spot, and his team is in a great spot to help Lucy's exoneration move forward. I believe Lucy will get a fair trial, and I believe she will be exonerated as a result. As I've said many times, I think she should just be exonerated. I don't think she should have to sit through another trial, but she probably will have to, and I think it will go well for her. I think Ben Myers was in an impossible situation. I think we have to give him some grace for that, even though he made incredible mistakes that are hard to understand. I think there are probably explanations for all of them that none of us have access to. So I feel for him. How could anybody win in those circumstances? They couldn't. But those circumstances are now long gone. The truth has come out. Lucy Letby is innocent. She did not commit any murders. She did not commit any attempted murders. She is an innocent woman, and she should be free today.